Hello, my name is Kim Buffard. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm Engineers Canada's Manager of Belonging and Engagement. Through this role, I manage all our outreach and engagement work and lead our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging team as we collaborate with multiple stakeholders within the engineering community to create a more welcoming and sustainable engineering profession. I am delighted to welcome you to the second session of the 2023 30 by 30 conference organized by Engineers Canada. Engineers Canada was founded to uphold the honor, integrity, and interests of the engineering profession. We work on behalf of the 12 provincial and territorial associations that regulate engineering practice and license the country more than 300,000 members of the engineering profession. And our vision is to advance Canadian engineering through national collaboration. So thank you so much for joining us today. Conversations today will be held on Discord. The channel is participant-led and will not be providing translating services for the Discord chat, but participants are welcome to participate in any language. I know that we have people joining us from across the country and would like to encourage you to get into Discord. You would have received a link in advance of today's session by email. So please take a few minutes now, if you haven't already, and get into Discord and let us know where you're joining us from. Throughout the session, we also encourage you to share your thoughts, ask each other questions, and actively engage in this topic. So as you're getting into Discord and letting us know where you're joining us from, I'll go through a few housekeeping items. Today's presenters will be speaking in English. However, there is simultaneous interpretation available in French. The instructions for how to access the interpretation are currently shown on the screen. Closed captioning in English is also available and can be accessed using the closed captioning button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. We do ask that you mute your microphone and turn off your camera to avoid any interruptions during the presentation. We remind everyone to approach this session with empathy, understanding, respect, and kindness for both your community and for yourselves. I'd like to introduce Gerard McDonald, CEO of Engineers Canada. Gerard is a senior executive with a proven track record of achieving strategic focus and developing collaborative relationships. Prior to his 4 years at Professional Engineers of Ontario, he spent over 30 years in public service roles, primarily within the country's transportation sector. This includes roles as Assistant Deputy Minister, Safety and Security at Transportation Canada, and Executive Director of the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. Over to you, Gerard.
Thanks, Kim. As part of our commitment to incorporating Indigenous ways of being and ways of knowing into the engineering profession, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from the unceded and traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Kanien'kehá:ka, and the traditional lands of the Wendat. As we are joining from across this land we now call Canada, I'd like to acknowledge all Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. As a profession, I think it is important to acknowledge the role the Indigenous community has played in engineering since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples have used engineering principles long before the profession itself was defined. There is a great deal for us as engineers to learn from Indigenous people, including the customs and traditions of Indigenous peoples to create better relationships between the engineering profession and their society. I, as CEO of Engineers Canada, commit to educating our colleagues on how the profession might collectively move forward, shining light on the truth, so that we may move forward in reconciliation in the spirit of cooperation. Today, we gather for the first session of the 30 by 30 conference. The 30 by 30 initiative is the engineering profession's goal to combat the culture of exclusion and increase belonging of women and gender diverse people in the engineering profession. One metric we use is this goal, that 30% of newly licensed engineers be female identifying by 2030. Currently, that number is at 19.8%. But as important as setting a goal and rallying a community around us is, over the past years, Canada has shifted away from diversity-only goals. We've identified the necessity of an intersectional approach and refocused our efforts on equity and belonging. We cannot just aim to increase the number of women and gender diverse people in the profession. The way women experience womanhood is broad, and so our understanding of systemic discrimination and systemic oppression must be broad as well. We can all agree that by its nature, engineering is a collaborative profession. Engineers work with folks from a variety of professional backgrounds to fulfill their duties and complete their jobs. Culture change is the responsibility of us all, but we have to recognize that we can and should depend on and listen to people with expertise in the topic of culture change, justice, and EDI. Engineers can't and shouldn't tackle this problem alone. To discuss EDI expertise and how to engage with professionals in the field, please welcome our speakers, Jocelyn Peltier-Huntley and Yasmin Tonachan Blacklock, and our moderator, Nicole McDonald. Jocelyn is an EDI researcher and professional mechanical engineer with nearly 20 years of experience in leading change. Through her business, Prairie Catalyst, Jocelyn is driven to create awareness and remove roadblocks so that all individuals and organizations can realize the benefits of inclusion and realize their full potential. Yasmin is our advisor for equity and belonging here at Engineers Canada, where she works on disbanding systems of marginalization and discrimination in the engineering field. Through her work and volunteerism, she has experience in anti-oppressive education, social justice, political advocacy, feminist international defense and security, and LGBTQIA+ healthcare. Nicole is a senior project manager and team leader at Colliers Project Leaders, representing project owners on capital and infrastructure projects. She primarily works with Northern Indigenous and not-for-profit clients and communities to deliver impactful projects such as community, cultural and recreational centers and healthcare facilities. Nicole is the past chair and current member of Engineers Canada's Indigenous Advisory Committee, which provides guidance to Engineers Canada in its journey towards reconciliation in engineering and in increasing Indigenous representation and inclusion in the engineering profession. I'll hand it over to you, Nicole.
Great. Thank you, Gerard. And thank you to everyone who is attending this session today. I'm so happy to be here to lead us through this important conversation. Belonging and inclusion are such important topics, not only in the workforce, but in society today. And we're so grateful that you're here to listen, to learn, and demonstrating your commitment to increasing equity, diversity, and inclusion in your organization. And there are so many words that fall into this subject: diversity, inclusion, equity, accessibility, belonging, sometimes even decolonization or indigenization. And just so you know, today we're using the acronym DEI, but we're really discussing the entire spectrum of inclusivity and making those important changes. So I'm just going to jump right into the conversation because I know we have so much to cover and everybody's looking forward to hearing our speakers. If we were to do a scan of different organizations across multiple industries, I'm sure that we would find a great variety in the journeys that these organizations are on with EDI and the place that they're currently at. So Jocelyn, I was hoping that you could share with us, what are some of the reasons that an organization would want to hire an EDI consultant? Because that's really the main topic we're looking at today. And at what point might they be looking to do that?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So first, it's important to think about why an organization doesn't already have a DEI strategy. Either it could be because leadership doesn't know that there's a problem, which is really common. Leaders maybe haven't allocated enough resources or time or money to solving the problem, or maybe well-meaning advocates and allies who might be sitting on a committee, they don't maybe have the time, the resources, the expertise, or the power to help solve the problem on their own. So in any of these cases, it can be really helpful to make the case why DEI is important. And we can do this by highlighting the challenges of people that are underrepresented in the organization. And we can do it through an EDI baseline assessment or a DEI baseline assessment. I might mix up and use a different acronym at times. Sorry about that. So the purpose of this assessment is really to bring to light the experiences of those with marginalized identities within a workplace. And so some people might have one or more aspects of their identity that are marginalized, or they might belong to more than one equity deserving group. And so that might mean, using myself as an example, women are underrepresented in the engineering profession. So that's one aspect of my identity that's marginalized. Someone who is maybe an Indigenous woman, they would be underrepresented in two different categories there. being Indigenous and being a woman. So we need to think about multiple aspects of identity and intersectionality when we're considering these things. And those that are onlys are those that, if there's not a lot of people like you, maybe working in your workplace or in your department, they're more likely to experience a lower sense of belonging and less psychological safety. So we want to try to highlight their experiences because it might be a lot different than the experiences of those who are currently sitting in leadership roles.
Okay, good. So we're collecting a lot of information, doing this baseline assessment, figuring out where we are as an organization and what the need is really. So when you're doing a baseline assessment, what kind of tools would you need, like through this first stage?
Yeah, good question. So as a first step, you'd want to ensure that you do a desktop review. So looking to see just where an organization is at, what kind of representation data is available. So maybe looking at some of the work that Engineers Canada has produced, or looking at Statistics Canada data for the region that you're working in, or it could be multiple regions, and looking at the relevant policies that you have in your organization as well. And then the next piece after that is engaging with people in the organization to understand their experiences and perceptions. So this can really vary on what this looks like. It depends on the size of the organization, maybe where it's located geographically, and just how in depth that you want to go into it. So different things that I've done in these baseline assessments, sometimes it's doing surveys, so you can do them broadly. Sometimes it's doing one-on-one interviews. Sometimes it could be doing focus groups. So I'll give a couple of examples of some projects that I've worked on. So with one client, they were a mining organization. They had operations in 2 different locations. So we used a really brief survey just to help as a recruitment tool with getting people into interviews. And then we did 30 one-on-one interviews across the 2 different locations. And you learn a lot by having these one-on-one interviews with people and understanding what the challenges are. Some of the people we interviewed were, I would say, underrepresented in their workplaces. They belong to one or more equity deserving group. And some of the others were part of the majority group. So they were cisgendered, able-bodied white men that were working within the organization too. So it's really important to hear from everyone, not just from the underrepresented people, because then you can help kind of compare and contrast the difference in experiences too. With another client that I worked with, who's a regulator, of one of the professions, we conducted a member survey first. So we had more than 1,300 people respond to the member survey. And then after that, we conducted a series of focus groups that were based around equity deserving groups. So we had one focused around women, one around Indigenous people, one around visible minorities, one around disabled persons. And the last one was for members of the 2S LGBTQ community, and also their allies were invited to attend as well. So there's a lot of people that are working as allies within the workplace, and we wanted to hear from them and the things that they were doing to make change happen in the organizations too.
Wow, good examples. And it's good to hear that that kind of activity is happening. And you did mention too that there are not only the people from the underrepresented groups, but the majority attending these types of activities too. And I guess my question is, were people generally like willing and feeling positive about participating in these types of activities?
Yes and no, it varies. I would say the ones that are willing to come to interviews often and focus groups, they're a bit more willing. Sometimes you hear a bit more difference of opinion, I guess, through surveys. People, when it's anonymous, people might say things that they might not say in person. So that's where sometimes some of the opposing comments definitely come out through surveys, I would say, more than one-on-one conversations.
Yeah, true. Well, I guess both are important. So
yeah.
So I think a lot of our attendees today are from organizations, and they're champions for EDI in their organizations and looking to continue to make change. And so if they are looking to seek out some of this external expertise and support, how they know where to start? Like, how do they know what to even ask for when they're trying to find a consultant to start with the baseline assessment?
Yeah, so I think there's lots of good questions that that can and should be asked around it. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know how to do the baseline assessment in order to hire someone to do it. So you don't have to be the expert, but maybe you want to ask some questions that will help you decide if the person that you're looking to hire is the right fit for you.
Mhm.
And they're probably going to ask you a bunch of questions too, just to try to understand where you're at. So if they're asking you questions, I think that's a good thing. If they don't ask a lot of questions, maybe that might be a little bit of a red flag. But some questions that I would generally ask is, why are you doing this work? Why are you interested in doing this work? Why is it important now? Kind of what's changed in the organization. Oftentimes there's something has happened that has changed, that is kind of flagging it now. Maybe it's a social issue that's kind of happening in the news. I think there was a lot of interest following 2020 and the pandemic and the death of George Floyd. But it could be other things happening within an organization as well, that there has maybe been an incident, or there's maybe been someone new come into the organization that's asking different questions. So it's important to understand the why now. Where the organization's at on their journey. A lot of organizations that I work with are very early, so they maybe haven't done a lot of work on it, and they're not really sure where to start, and that's okay. And some organizations might be further along, and they're looking for a specific scope of work to help them kind of take that next step, and that's great too. So understanding where they're at helps with figuring out what they need next. And then asking who's supporting the work too, because it's really important to have leadership support in doing this work. So who's championing or sponsoring this work? If there's not someone from senior leadership on board, that would maybe be a bit of a red flag for me, because I wouldn't want this work to not help progress things within the organization. And if we need to help convince someone that it's important, who is that person that we need to convince, and what might be convincing for them? And then thinking about who needs to be engaged in the work too. So kind of who are the people within the organization that should have a say in this, who maybe needs to be informed. So kind of thinking about it in terms of like a RACI chart almost, and who are the people that we're going to directly engage with. And then thinking about what that next step might be to take the organization forward, and the timeline around it. So is there a board meeting coming up? Is there a budget decision? Is there something happening, in the next few months that we want to make sure that we have this information in hand? And then another important thing too is just thinking about how does truth and reconciliation fit into all of this as well. There's definitely overlaps between doing DEI work and truth and reconciliation. So I'm always interested to know where an organization's at with answering the calls to action as well.
Okay, good. So it sounds like really a two-way conversation between the organization and the consultant, and just trying to understand, where they're at, why are they doing this, what is the level of commitment, and who's going to be involved, those kind of things. Good. And I think organizations are asking themselves these questions, asking their consultants these questions, and specifically an EDI consultant that we're talking about today. But I think these are questions that we need to be asking all of our potential vendors, right? Not just the specific EDI consultant. And myself, just being a project manager working on capital projects, I'm working with organizations all the time doing procurements. So I get excited about procurement. But most organizations, regardless of their industry, they're procuring vendors and consultants or help of some kind. And so I think what we're starting to see more and more, and especially on capital projects that I'm working on, are clients and organizations that are incorporating diversity and inclusion questions right in their requests for proposals for any type of services or maybe even goods. So they may require bidders to provide information on their DEI policies in the organization, perhaps even a statement or a commitment on truth and reconciliation, as you mentioned. They may even have to provide examples of workforce diversity initiatives that are ongoing, what they're actively doing to make their workplace more inclusive, and maybe even asking bidders for tangible actions that their organization has taken, and what the outcomes have been. Like, has there been meaningful impact? Has it been positive? Are there any changes needed? And that's really when you're trying to hire somebody. If you're delivering an actual project, maybe on a larger scale or over the longer term, you may even want to ask your vendors to demonstrate how will they incorporate DEI through project delivery. So that might mean creating employment opportunities for underrepresented groups, supporting a more diverse supplier network and vendor network, maybe providing evidence that DEI training is being provided to all workers, and then having plans in place to address issues like issues of harassment, discrimination, corrective actions that might need to be taken. So personally, I'm seeing this more kind of in the public realm where there's public dollars being spent and the clients are looking to meet these kind of commitments, for societal benefit. But I do think we're moving in the right direction. Organizations are looking to diversify their supplier network and really have that positive influence downstream, no matter what industry they're in. So I know today we're talking so much about DEI consultants and expertise, but I think any organization can start to make those changes, regardless of what their industry is and what their activities are. So, so to get back to our conversation, Jocelyn, once we've successfully engaged one of these consultants, an EDI consultant, asked those questions, had those discussions, and then we complete the baseline assessment that we talked about, what comes after that?
Good question. And I think building on your point too, Nicole, having those EDI purpose statements, those commitments, those visionary statements from the organizational level is really important. You might see them sometimes on a company's website, but also, if you're responding to a procurement thing, like you were saying too, you want to be able to say, this is where we stand on this issue, and this is what we're doing to try to make it better, recognizing, that things aren't going maybe well for everyone right now. So I think having those statements is really important. It helps, I think, with internally within an organization and externally as well, and can help with recruiting and procurement and business growth too. So the other thing would be after that, so having that kind of high level purpose visionary statement that kind of tells the why, but then thinking about how is DEI going to be embedded throughout the organization. It's not just one person or one group's job to do it. It needs to kind of be everywhere and proliferate everywhere, just like health and safety, I would say, is within engineering. So it really needs to be embedded in the organizational strategy and kind of a component of it probably within everyone's job description and their roles and responsibilities. And then after that, kind of identifying those specific actions that are going to help with an organization progressing over the next 2 to 3 years. So what are those, tangible deliverables that we can say that we're going to do, that we can measure and we can make sure are moving things forward. And then it really depends where the organization's at, just kind of what other things might be, but it could involve developing policies, training that might go out to leaders or employees, or depending on who the organization's interacting with, maybe suppliers or contractors that they're looking to engage with as well. And then thinking about, of course, if you're in that leadership role, who are the resources and what is the budget that's going to help support all of this too? So oftentimes DEI efforts start off with a volunteer committee and people are doing it off the side of their desks. But at some point, if the organization is going to prioritize it, you maybe need to have dedicated resources working on it, and then they need a budget to do the work. So to hire the consultants and to move things forward within the organization.
Exactly. And Yasmin, I know you're doing this work, so why don't you speak a little bit too, since we've been chatting away here.
Yeah. And we're going to get into this a little bit later, I think, but I just want to note how important it is what Jocelyn just said about kind of like these tangible manifestations of EDI work. It can't just be a marketing exercise. It can't be a public relations campaign. It actually needs to change the nature of how the organization works and how people feel in the organization. So those were some really great examples of metrics that you can actually see creating that change.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. True. So we've talked a little bit about evaluating the organization's commitment, moving towards actions and outcomes, and even procurement. So like things are moving in the right direction. So we understand, I'd say now, how we start this assessment and how the journey starts for an organization. So the practitioners themselves, like EDI consultants, EDI experts, obviously there isn't I don't think a degree out there in EDI. So how do we know how to assess the skills, the educational backgrounds, the experiences that these individuals or groups might have, and what should we be looking for?
Mm-hmm. So you're totally right. There is no one kind of definition or degree or certification that creates an EDI practitioner. Technically, anyone can just say, I'm an EDI practitioner, and okay, I guess they are. That being said, there definitely are things that you can look for. So when you're talking about education, for example, there are degrees that have competencies that indicate that this person would be able to do EDI work. So, you know, the most obvious direct connections would be gender studies, Black studies, Indigenous studies, you know, to some extent, politics, law, sociology, those kind of social studies fields where people have to understand systemic and societal powers and power dynamics. That sets you up pretty well to understand the nature of EDI work. But by no means are those the only backgrounds that people can have. You know, you can have an engineering degree, for example, and become an EDI practitioner, for example, Jocelyn. So it's a nice to have, it's a good indicator, but it's not the be all and end all. The other thing is there are a few certificates, programs, designations out there, but even within the EDI community, those have to them. They can be indicators of knowledge, sometimes they're not. And it's kind of, you know, I think of LinkedIn courses where sometimes, yeah, they indicate that there is a competency or a skill here. And sometimes, you know, you can kind of click through it on your computer and then you have a certification in Excel, for example, right? So that's another thing that it's nice to have. It can indicate a few things, but it's not necessary to become a successful EDI practitioner. And so we kind of move into this idea of competencies and what are those competencies? And I know in my experience, when we hire EDI consultants, the number one thing that's like the absolute bare minimum is they must do their work from an intersectional framework. And I know a lot of folks have heard the term intersectionality before. If you have, why don't you pop it into the Discord chat, maybe your experiences with intersectionality. But at the highest level, intersectionality is a political, a theoretical movement, framework, thought process, epistemic tradition rooted in Black feminism. And it's existed for centuries. But the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And I like to bring that up because first we have to give credit to her for coming up with this fantastic term. And the second one is if you actually go through that paper, you'll start to realize why she came up with intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw was a legal scholar, which kind of calls back, you can be a legal scholar and be an EDI practitioner. And she studied 3 court cases. The first court case was a suit brought up by a group of Black women who wanted to sue for sex and race discrimination. And the courts took a look at this case and said, well, they've hired Black men and they've hired white women, and therefore you don't have a case. There's clearly no sex discrimination. There's women there. And there's no race discrimination. There are Black men there. So they threw that case out. The second case was, again, another suit where a group of Black women brought their claim to court for discrimination. And the court said, well, you're claiming specifically as Black women. This doesn't impact white women, and therefore it's not gender discrimination because it's not impacting all women. And so they were unsuccessful again. And then the third case that she used is Black women successfully brought forward a discrimination suit on pay equity, I believe it was. There was a pay inequity. So the courts ruled in their favor, but they failed to apply that resolution to Black men, even though Black men were also suffering from pay inequity based on race discrimination. So only Black women received the solution there. And so when we look at, you know, the nitty-gritty of Kimberly Crenshaw's paper, we see the need that Black women are not white women and Black women are not Black men. They are their own unique group of people who experience womanhood uniquely. They experience Blackness uniquely. And so when I think an EDI practitioner, I think it's really important to kind of do a thought process and a thought exercise. Would Black women be visible in the work that they are telling you that they think they need to do? One way that you could do that is kind of along 2 lines of identity. Do they have expertise along at least 2 lines of identity, whether that be gender, race, class, ability, age, nationality, whatever it may be. But as long as they have expertise in 2 lines of identity and the systemic manifestations of oppression of that identity, then you're probably on a good route. The other thing that I'd want to say is kind of when you go down this line of thought, you eventually get to this place of behavior change versus systemic change. Behavior change has its place. Training individuals can be important, it can be useful, but it cannot be the only solution. Because while individuals produce and reproduce oppression, inequality, discrimination, it's also in our systems. And so if we're going to train everybody to be, anti-racist, that's great. We should definitely strive to do that. But if the systems and policies in place, calling back to what Jocelyn said about changing policy, no matter how many people in the room are good, the workplace is still going to produce discrimination. So it needs to come from a systemic place as well. The last thing I will leave you with is this idea of diversity versus inclusion versus equity versus justice and belonging. So diversity is kind of the state of being. Humans by nature are diverse. It is a measurement of how many bodies are in the room or not in the room. It should not necessarily be the goal. It can be a tool, but it should not be the end goal. Inclusion is when you bring people into the room under your own kind of definitions of what inclusion should look like. Equity is when you start disbanding those systems of oppression and you start to kind of give people what they need when it is specific to their situation. So you're looking at them, their humanity, their personhood, and you are helping them with solutions that are specific to them. And justice is kind of all of those things combined. Belonging is all of those things combined when people get to define whether or not they feel included. So you're not just saying, inclusion to me looks like this, I will do it for you, therefore we are inclusive. You're saying, what makes you feel included? And then you create a system with them collaboratively. So that was a lot. So I'll take a pause and I know we'll pick back up on some of those points later.
Wow, that was amazing. I'm thinking I have to go back later and listen to what you said again, because there was so much great stuff in there. And I like at the end, actually, maybe we should have started with kind of defining some of these words and the meanings. And I hadn't used the word justice there at the beginning when we talked about some of the different words that are encompassed in this conversation. But I agree, that's great. Like, we cannot define for someone else what their belonging and inclusion looks like. They need to define it and then feel that, yes, this has been successful. They do truly feel included. So we talked a bit about there, I guess where you started was how to evaluate, the skill set and the competencies. So this type of expertise, when we're looking to hire a consultant, it's a lot more qualitative, the evaluation and competency based than other areas of expertise where organizations might be procuring services. So once an organization has evaluated that skill set, selected somebody who's the right fit for the organization, what can the organizations, or maybe some of the individuals attending here and listening today, because they'd be the one perhaps leading these efforts on behalf of their organizations, what can they expect from that consultant? So in different industries or hiring different types of expertise, you sort of, what to expect. There's kind of a baseline, to use that term again, for what those services will be and what the outcomes will be, what the deliverables might be. But really, I think setting those expectations at the beginning, making sure everybody's on the same page is so important so that we get through, some good work together. And both sides should be holding up their ends of the agreement. So I'd like to hear, from both of you and what you think about this. But Jocelyn, do you maybe want to speak to what someone can expect from someone like you, right? They're hiring as an EDI expert.
Yeah. So I think like with any project, you would want to have a clear project scope outlining the deliverables. Maybe you don't know exactly what those deliverables are. So oftentimes, like if I haven't worked with a client before, sometimes it's a conversation and it's like, okay, the third round of the proposal, like that's kind of closer to what they maybe actually need. But you don't know till they kind of have a chance to look at it because they maybe haven't thought about DEI stuff before. They're not sure exactly what they need. So it can take a few iterations and that's totally okay. I think knowing what the cost of the project is, you probably have a budget that you're coming into it. So if you want to be upfront about what that budget is, that can help. Doing one-on-one interviews costs a lot more than doing a survey through an organization because it takes more time and effort to do that. But you can get a lot of in-depth, valuable information from one-on-one interviews. So if you have the budget, I would go for that. But if you don't, start off with a survey is always good. And then knowing what the schedule is. What are those things happening within the organization that we need to maybe plan for because we want to have this deliverable in hand for then? Or is there a shutdown or a vacation period coming up where people are going to be unavailable and we don't want to be planning that people are going to be doing a survey, say over summer holidays, because you're probably going to get really low participation. So thinking about the schedule aspects important. Often a lot of this gets captured in the contract as well. Outside of that, though, having a project charter is really important just after you get through the contract phase and knowing how you're going to work together with the consultants, knowing kind of what everyone's roles and responsibilities are, who is that project sponsor or champion in the organization that maybe wants to be informed, or maybe they just want to see the final report when it's done. How involved do they actually want to be in everything? And it's important to understand, I think, what everyone's doing from the client and the consultant perspective too. Sometimes consultants, often I'll bring in other people as well, as Yasmin was talking about, to bring in other perspectives. Because I'm a white woman working in this space, I don't have experiences with maybe with racism like other people would. So bringing in Indigenous consultants, Black consultants, they can help give different perspectives. So it depends on what the organization is looking for too, but try to bring in different people depending on what they need. I think what's different and unique about DEI consulting, though, is a couple things. So going back to what Yasmin was saying about how we're kind of what data types we're collecting. Data is not just, and this is going to be a shock for engineering people listening, but it's not just numbers. We need to think beyond numbers, and we need to really think about people's experiences. We want mixed methods. We want qualitative and quantitative data. So the consultant should have some experience, I would say, with doing mixed methods analysis, collecting both of these data types and doing analysis on both of these data types. So probably asking some questions around mixed methods would be important. And again, you don't have to understand what that is and how to do it, but your consultant should have that expertise. And then the other thing that's really important is we're going to be asking people to share some potentially really personal information. Information maybe about their identities that you don't currently know as an employer, and could be telling some private stories that could be traumatic as well. So you want to ensure that participants' privacy and confidentiality and anonymity are protected. That is the most important thing. There has to be trust and transparency in the process, or people aren't going to engage. So if you haven't done something like this before, it's really important. If you have done something like this before and it didn't go well, there's probably not going to be a lot of trust in the organization. And you probably wouldn't want to start with doing one-on-one interviews. You'd probably want to start with doing a survey where people can give that anonymous feedback into kind of what's happening in the organization. But either way, data needs to be combined so that individuals aren't identifiable. So you want to have that intersectional data collected, and doing that through a survey. Even when I am doing one-on-one interviews, often I'll, through that initial recruitment survey, I'll kind of ask those identity questions so that people can give me that information ahead of time. And then when we're getting into focus groups or interviews, we don't have to ask that personal information, and we can focus on kind of the experiences. So understanding in the contract, just how that data is going to be managed, and probably having some terms and conditions in your contract around data management and privacy, and connecting to federal privacy laws and provincial privacy laws, that would all be really important. A benefit of using a consultant over having, say, someone in HR conduct this work internally is that it's a third party. And so people might feel safer. They might feel psychologically safer to speak up and tell their stories about what's been happening. And depending on the history in the organization too, maybe the person's tried to speak up to different people before and hasn't felt heard. So it's a way to help elevate people's stories in a safe way, I think, by bringing in a consultant. And you're going to have more trust in the process if it's really clear on just how people's data is going to be managed. So I think it's really important that you, as the person hiring the EDI consultant, you don't ask to see the data. You don't necessarily need to see the data. You want the report where everything's been blended together and you're seeing kind of the themes that are coming out of the analysis, but you probably don't need to see the data behind it to see who was talking to the consultant or anything like that.
Excellent. Wow. A lot, right? But I mean, all so important. I was getting excited talking about scope, budget, schedule. Those are lots of project manager things. But you're right, like the trust, the privacy, all those things would be so important. We're asking for very personal information and sensitive information, and really trust between those individuals and the organization could be built up or could be destroyed based on how this is handled, right? How the process and the information is handled.
I thought of one more thing too. So
Sure.
the other thing, I guess, is the report should, or in some form should be made available back to the people who participated in it. If they trusted enough to tell their story into the process, they should see the results of it coming out. And I think that can be really affirming, especially for people that are underrepresented and equity deserving, marginalized within an organization, because oftentimes it feels like it's only happening to you. I've been in those situations. And so then seeing all the data come out and seeing, you know what, this is a reoccurring problem happening across departments, across multiple groups of people. It's maybe impacting some groups more than others, but having that information come out and made available, I think, is really important. So leaders or the committee, whoever's leading the work, they need to make sure that they're sharing that back to the people that participated.
And I might just jump in as well and kind of go back to what Jocelyn said about kind of the numbers thing. And it's something that I've found very interesting when I take on these projects and we hear from folks who maybe haven't been part of these projects before. There's kind of this moment when they realize that this work exists in a completely different paradigm, a different knowledge production system. It looks different than most, maybe not most, but many different types of projects that people might have undertaken. And so it's okay that things are gray areas. I find we work best in gray areas when we're trying to move this work forward. It can't be just black and white. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. And then a little bit about the data collection piece. I don't know if other folks have maybe experienced this, but I know I've been to, maybe a conference or something like that. And at the end of it, they give you a form to fill out and they ask, are you a woman? Are you trans? Your gender identity, your racial identity? And, there have been occasions where I did not enjoy my time in that space. Maybe I faced discrimination in that space or somebody used inappropriate language in that space. And you kind of have this moment of, are they going to then post on their website that it was 50% women? Meanwhile, the women were very uncomfortable in the room the entire time. And that has an impact on people, on their willingness to self-identify, even if you're just doing demographic data collection. That's a very, I don't want to invalidate people's experiences, but when we look at the history of like colonization in this land we call Canada, data collection was used against trans people, Indigenous people, Black people, Chinese people. And so self-identifying was actually dangerous. And that carries on even to this day. Those fears are still very, very real. And so it's kind of that question of, is there trust building? Do people feel like they can actually identify and it will actually lead to their full humanity being realized? The other thing too is I've worked with a really fantastic consultant recently who is writing on the experiences of women in the engineering profession. And we had people who did not want to participate because they were so afraid of the backlash of sharing their stories, of this project being associated with Engineers Canada. They had to leave the profession because of the trauma they faced. They don't want to be anywhere near it. And so we worked with a consultant who was able to go above and beyond to create a safe space. They were able to pay the honoraria. So Engineers Canada does not know who this person was, does not know anything about them, any identifiable information, doesn't know the questions that were asked, the answers that were given. We just have that final report, like Jocelyn said. And so it's really important that people are empathetic and caring when they're doing the survey collection, data collection, especially if you want to hear maybe what an organization isn't doing so well. They need to feel like it will actually result in justice.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wanted to just build on one other thing you said too. Everything should be optional, and like in the consent statement, in the survey, in the focus group, in interviews, people don't have to answer a question they don't feel comfortable with. They can skip over it. They can ask to leave at any time. That's really important. The data collection has to center the person who we're asking to be vulnerable and share sometimes these traumatic things. And we need to make it safe for them. So that's really, really important. So on a survey, there should, none of the questions should be mandatory. Maybe the first one sometimes is, if it needs to be a filter question to like, are you the right person to even be answering the survey? Do you kind of belong to this group that we're trying to understand? But otherwise, everything else should be optional. And sometimes that speaks to the level of trust within an organization. If you had 20% people that clicked the prefer not to answer box on all the identity questions, that tells you that there's probably not a high level of trust within the organization. So that still tells something, even though we don't know more details about that individual.
Good. These are important points. I'm glad that we got to the topic, or using the terminology of safe space, right? Because that's so important in this whole process. It could have been, the starting place for this conversation. So there's so many points, but just touching back on, sharing the information and not the data, but the final report back with the organization, which could be, senior leadership. It could be the EDI committee or the group that initiated the study or the work. But also with the participants, right? Because they should be able to validate that they have been heard and that they have been heard accurately, I would say, in the report, and not misconstrued or any way. So these leaders, we talked about leaders because we talked about the commitment of the organization to doing this work and going on this journey. But they're probably not going to be the individuals that are actually, procuring the consultant and doing the work in the organization. So how would leaders be involved through this process if they're not individuals maybe participating in focus groups or interviews, or maybe they are? Like, how are they involved?
Yeah, good question. So I guess first there should be a senior leader identified in that project charter. Maybe they're not the one directly leading the work, but they should be sponsoring or championing the work. And helping clear any roadblocks that the consultant might encounter as they're doing the project. And then once that baseline assessment is done, I think that's probably where leaders have the biggest role to play. So you've identified then problems within an organization. The consultants probably offered some recommendations on what needs to happen next. So now the leaders need to step up and take action with those things. So they have a really important role to play in making decisions once they have this new information and setting the tone for workplace culture, because it's probably going to highlight issues with workplace culture, which comes down to some of those individual behavior changes, things that Yasmin was mentioning, but also importantly, leaders set the strategy within an organization. So they can act as allies in those individual kind of one-on-one engagements with people, but they also have to set the strategy. They can engage with the consultant in training sessions. Maybe the leader, oftentimes leaders in organizations, they are not there's not a lot of underrepresented people. If you look at some of the McKinsey and Lean In reports, there tends to be more white men in leadership roles than there are anyone else. Others tend to get filtered kind of as they move up through their careers. So leaders might not have a lot of direct personal experience with some of the inequities that are being highlighted in the report. So they need to do some learning in these areas. So training sessions with the consultant can help. Oftentimes I take the baseline assessment report and it's like, okay, we're going to work through these concepts and we're going to work and help you kind of process some of these things and what they mean and what things you need to reflect on. So I think that can be a really important part. Helping expand their understanding. Leaders need to be able to talk about the results in there and talk about what they're going to be doing around it. So part of it might be building capacity within leadership groups so that they have the confidence to engage in conversations about DEI, coming from a place sometimes that might be a privileged position. So helping them out with some of the terminology that we've been talking about so they can talk about it in conversations, so they can talk about sexism and racism, even though they maybe personally haven't experienced these things. That's really going to help them. And it's going to help them with setting the strategies that need to be set to take those next steps towards advancing DEI or towards answering the calls to action around truth and reconciliation. So once the strategies are set, the other important thing that leaders need to do is make sure there's budget, make sure there's resources to help those things actually happen. We don't want to just put the burden onto people who might already be facing challenges in the organization. Oftentimes on DEI committees, you see a lot of people that have faced challenges, that are underrepresented, that are marginalized. And we don't want to put all of the burden on them to try to fix the workplace culture when they're still dealing with some of the challenges within the workplace culture. So leaders need to take an active role, and they also need to make sure that the resources and the money is there.
Mhm. Yeah, just building on what Jocelyn said, leaders are truly the gatekeepers of workplace culture. If you think back to your own workplaces, you know, what initiatives or projects had the CEO and a director on them, and there were lots of resources dedicated to them. There are power dynamics at play where if leaders think that this is important, it follows that most of the org is important. The other thing, like Jocelyn said, distributing the labor of EDI work among many people is really important. A lot of times we see, you know, maybe one junior person who's tasked with creating systemic change. That is a huge undertaking and a very hard job. And so if leaders are involved with that, they can leverage their privilege, their power, their positionality in service of EDI goals. And so if it's woven throughout the organization, not only is it easier for everyone involved, but it's more likely to be successful. And again, we see a lot of, you know, the EDI kind of initiative will be the responsibility of a volunteer committee. And that kind of builds on this idea of EDI as a trend. Like Jocelyn said, we saw a huge amount of EDI practices, principles, practitioners come into the space in 2020. And already there are so many studies out there that this year and last year, EDI folks are the first ones to be let go when, you know, there's a recession or if there's mass layoffs. And so what we don't need is to consider EDI a trend because it's not. Justice is not a trend. You know, people have been resisting injustices for thousands of years. And so addressing those concerns in a workplace, it's not new. It's just the modern manifestation of it.
You're so right. And we see, you know, volunteer committees and organizations like social committee or a green committee or whatever. But actually, Jocelyn mentioned earlier, I think health and safety, that's not something that's optional or volunteer anymore. You know, organizations must have health and safety plans and policies and joint health and safety committees, those types of things. And why would EDI work, you know, be any different? So we're coming close to the end of our time, but I wanted to touch on one term that we haven't really used too much yet, a little bit, but the word ally or allyship. And that's such a huge word in this space and in this conversation. You can't really talk about EDI without talking about allies. So how can allies, either leaders or other members of the organizations, be involved in all of this?
Yeah, so allyship is it's the focus of my PhD program, actually.
Oh.
So I've done a lot of thinking and learning about allies. So allyship is the practice of being inclusive, is kind of the working definition that I'm going with right now. People often don't call themselves an ally. It's kind of interesting, but that's kind of the best word to describe what allyship is. So you might notice allyship behaviors in other people, but you might not necessarily call yourself an ally. But if we want to think about, you know, that we're working to be allies or kind of that's a visionary goal, something that we're aiming for, we can think about allyship in kind of two different buckets. So we need people to be proactive and reactive allies. And these terms come from two researchers out of UBC, D'Souza and Schmader. And so proactive allyship are things that we can plan and things that we can maybe put into our calendars. Whereas reactive allyship are often things that occur kind of in the moment in everyday interactions. So reactive allyship might involve addressing a microaggression that kind of pops up in a meeting, something somebody said that was maybe a bit inappropriate and you want to address that, or it could be reinforcing the great work that someone is doing on the team. Maybe someone who's underrepresented, who isn't getting noticed or isn't getting credit for the work that they're doing. Those are both reactive things that we can do and, you know, say something. Often these things are related to communication. Proactive allyship is a little bit different though. So this might involve attending training. It might involve listening to this webinar today. It might involve choosing to mentor someone from an underrepresented group in the profession. It's things that you're probably going to schedule into your calendar and you're going to plan ahead. So something that you might have in your continuous professional development plan are examples of proactive allyship. Speaking up, reactive allyship is not always comfortable. So these are things that we can maybe take some training around to work at finding ways that work for us. Everyone's different, and there might be different ways. Extroverted people might be seem quicker to speak up about injustices that are happening if they hear a comment in a meeting. People who are maybe a little bit more introverted like me, I'm maybe more likely to circle back with someone afterwards and give them some feedback afterwards. So either way, though, we can think about allyship as kind of a broad set of skills or behaviors, but we're trying to be inclusive, and we're trying to have an inclusive workplace culture. That's kind of the goal of allyship.
And just to kind of wrap up what Jocelyn was saying, I know some people have been using the word accomplice as well, and I'm, still not 100% sure where that term stands, but I think it's important when we think about the urgency of this work, and we're going to talk about this in the next 2 sessions that are coming up over the next 2 weeks. But for some people, this is life and death. There are people leaving the profession. There are people who are at a point of suicidal ideation. There are people who are facing violence. It truly, at the highest level, it can be life or death. And so when we talk about allyship, it's also, it's leaders, like I said, leveraging their power to create EDI goals, to create that belonging. And the reason why I like the word accomplice sometimes is because it implies that you're willing to break the rules sometimes. You're okay being a disruptor. You are okay kind of being the person that says, no, wait, I'm disrupting this conversation. I'm changing the course of this conversation. And it's putting yourself out there for criticism quite a lot of the time, but it's an understanding of this is urgent, this is life or death for people. And so if I make people uncomfortable in this one scenario, it is what it is. And so just wanted to leave us on the kind of the urgency. Hiring EDI practitioners is so important. To have people with those expertise. Being an ally, it's so important because people need each other in order to be. So just wanted to leave us with that.
I think that's a great way for us to end. We all feel, I think, a little more excited. We feel the urgency to go out there and to continue doing this good work, right? So I think that we've probably given everyone listening today some tangible takeaways, some ideas that they can take back, to continue championing DEI in their organizations. We talked about why this is important. I think we're here, we know why it's important, how the process starts. We talked through the baseline assessment, what questions we might ask of the consultant, how to set those expectations, how to work together. And then we also talked a lot about, leaders and their role, and then the role of allies, the importance of allies, which I would say everyone here today is minimum an ally, perhaps an accomplice. Maybe that's what we'll start striving for. So thank you so much, Jocelyn and Yasmin. You're both such experts in this area. I mean, it was wonderful to talk with you about this. And thanks to everyone who was here listening. I really think you probably have some great takeaways. So we're pretty much at the end of our time. And so I'm going to hand it back to Kim just to wrap up our session for the day.
Well, thank you, Yasmin, Nicole, and Jocelyn for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. That was a fantastic session. I really like how you mentioned the urgency. So the urgency of EDI in the profession, it gets more apparent as time goes on. And we hope that the topic covered today will assist you, everyone participating today, in bringing this sort of forward within your organizations, figuring out new ways to work with your peers to create a more inclusive and equitable workplace. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I also want to thank Gerard, our CEO, for his support and ongoing, championing essentially the work that we're doing when it comes to equity, diversity, inclusion within the engineering profession and through Engineers Canada. If you want to reflect back on the teachings of today, recordings of all virtual sessions will be made available on Engineers Canada's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We will also keep the Discord channel open for the next hour to ensure that anyone who wants to directly engage in the conversation with their peers can continue to do so. And we're hoping that the discussion today has, in fact, brought up some new ideas and things that you may want to share and learn from one another. In the interim, I encourage you to please join us for the next virtual session on Wednesday, May 10th, when the topic will be guidelines for EDI, and we'll be welcoming anti-racism expert Dr. Camille Hernard-Radwar, Marcy Cochran, who's the EDI specialist at Engineers Geoscientists, British Columbia, and Eileen Sowuni, who is our Associate of Outreach and Belonging at Engineers Canada. During that session, we'll also be hearing from Tim Joseph, who is our Board 30 by 30 champion. The registration link will be shared in the chat and on the Discord server. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.